Hordak is the big bad overlord in She-Ra, but he's hardly the show's main villain, and the show treats him more as a challenge for Catra to overcome than anything else. As I rewatch She-Ra, I noticed that Hordak is only a villain through namesake, and his position in the world is similar to Catra's. What I mean by that is Catra is to Hordak what Hordak is to Horde Prime, a mere underling who feels that they have to prove their worth to a higher power. We know throughout the entire show that Hordak has been working tirelessly for decades to figure out a way to return to Horde Prime, the very person who abused him and set him up to fail. This is a very similar storyline for Catra, working tirelessly to appease her superiors, to receive the admiration and affection she craves, just like Hordak, but they both ignore the fact that achieving this goal will result in their own downfall. Hordak often gets dismissed as just another cartoony villain, but his journey has psychology woven into it. It often gets overlooked. And the most curious part about this is, to me, it's an experience that he shares with Catra. Part of this story is the cycle of abuse. Horde Prime was awful to Hordak, who was awful to Shadow Weaver, who was awful to Catra, who was awful to Scorpia, and Scorpia is the one who finally broke the cycle by realizing this is really bad, and the only thing she can do is to get as far away from Catra as she can and seek help from vastly different people. The Princess Alliance. In Season 4. Hordak and Catra are desperately seeking the approval of a higher power in hopes that once their efforts are recognized, the abuse will stop. We see this when Catra gloats to Shadow Weaver about taking her mother's role in the Horde, and is frustrated that Shadow Weaver still doesn't respect her. Catra has a belief that if she lived up to the expectations that Shadow Weaver placed on Adora, that would mean Shadow Weaver would adore Catra and reward her for her success. We all know this is dumb, but you and I both have knowledge of what a healthy parent and child relationship looks like, while for Catra, this is all she has ever known, so how could she even realize what a terrible situation she's in? Of course, Catra will learn over time that this acceptance fantasy is wrong, and she should pursue fulfilling her own happiness, and not pursue fulfilling the happiness of others in exchange for validation. We know that Catra wants to be with Adora, which would bring her happiness, and maybe fulfillment, which we see get resolved in the show's finale. But throughout the show and from episode 2, Catra cannot accept this as she has been brainwashed away from such actions, and despite having a choice, doesn't feel like she has one. The same thing is true for Hordak. He was indoctrinated since birth, just like Catra, but to believe that Horde Prime is the supreme being, a living god who's as old as the cosmos itself. Allegedly, Prime violently crushes dissent and individuality, stripping all of his subjects of features and beliefs. Hordak never had the opportunity to think for himself, because if Prime ever read his mind and found out that any of his clones were questioning reality, their minds would be erased. We see this process doesn't work 100% of the time. By the moments we're entrapped and Catra spark some of Hordak's old memories in Season 5, but those experiences were deeply ingrained into Hordak, so it makes sense that some chemicals and electricity wouldn't fully remove his individuality, even though we know from inhumane experiments that electricity through the brain can actually completely change you as an individual. So while this is faulty in the show, I still like the narrative aspect, so we'll move along. What this has to do with Hordak's villainy is he was indoctrinated to never ever think for himself. That was punishable by a form of death, which the show demonstrates to the audience. Since Horde Prime has access to the memories and eyes of every single clone, there's no way for Hordak to be discreet about his beliefs. Hordak never learned to think for himself, and if he did, it would risk everything. So it makes sense that when Hordak arrived on Etheria, his behavior was so tailored to his experience with Prime that he would perpetuate everything he had learned from Prime, the only differences being his lack of special powers. It wasn't until Hordak met Entrapta and fell in love that he began to think with intention and emotion. We can see even before that, the Horde existed for decades, and global domination was not his prime motivation. It was returning to Prime. Shadow Weaver, outside of a handful of orders from Hordak, was the one leading the Horde. We see this again when Catra rises to power. Catra makes basically every decision, only occasionally with Hordak's input. Global domination is not what Hordak cared about, but he knows that's what Prime would care about, so, Hordak tries to own the planet as a gift of appeasement, even if it's a half-assed attempt. I feel empathy for Hordak because despite being an awful person, he was created that way, and when he was no longer in Horde Prime's environment, he began to improve. Meaning, despite everything, there's a seed of goodness that grows as he spends more time on Etheria. Hordak never stripped away his soldiers' individuality. He didn't care that Adore changed sides. He doesn't care that he and Shadow Weaver disagree on basically everything. He just wants to make his portal and have a little gift of planetary control, which he knows Prime will like, and not because he actually cares about controlling any of that stuff at all. When left to his own devices, Hordak was an infinitely better person than he was under Horde Prime, but I can only sing high praise because Horde Prime is pure evil, so anything other than that will look like purity. When Hordak met Entrapta, he learned empathy, appreciation. He learned to be nice and genuinely bond with somebody, not because he was obligated to, but because he admired Entrapta in a way that surpassed his admiration of Prime. Through Entrapta, Hordak started learning behaviors from her that made him a better individual. If Hordak didn't lose Entrapta in Season 3, Hordak would have potentially grown into an upstanding individual and overcome his daddy issues. This is why I don't think Hordak is inherently evil. He was forced to be evil from birth. Propaganda made him believe everything that happened around him was morally correct. But the moment he was no longer in that environment, he was a much better person and only became better as time went on. If Catra hadn't re-traumatized Hordak and forced him to help her take over Etheria, I'd feel like Hordak would have ended the war and lived out the rest of his life with Entrapta in peace. He has a very natural villain to hero trajectory, or at least villain to neutral. I love how it happened organically, and the show used Catra's abuse and manipulation to maintain his villainy in the storyline, illustrating the cycle of abuse. Shadow Weaver, Catra, and Scorpia reveal more aspects of this and provide meaningful insight to this system, but before I continue, I would greatly appreciate if you tap that like button for me. I'll start with Shadow Weaver because I want to go down the chain chronologically. Shadow Weaver went from role of a teacher, a hero, charged with rearing the world's most powerful sorcerer. She betrays and murders her fellow sorcerers for disagreeing with her over how to handle the Horde's invasion. Rather than follow through on her beliefs, she opts to punish the people who disagreed with her and joins the Horde as she plots revenge. Shadow Weaver is acting purely out of spite in this scenario and subjecting herself to a hostile work environment in order to get away with murder. Her storyline is almost the exact opposite of Hordak. Shadow Weaver's backstory is much more cartoon villain than Hordak's by virtue of pure assholery. Shadow Weaver takes out her frustrations and anger on Catra. Catra was a vulnerable child, easy to make a victim. Without a voice to speak out against the abuse and no repercussions for Shadow Weaver's behavior, Shadow Weaver made the conscious decision to quit being a good person and embrace villainy. She intended to perpetuate the cycle of abuse, whereas Hordak did not. The reason I gave Hordak and Catra a slight pass, despite their horrendous actions, is because they were raised a certain way and weren't in an environment that rewarded being good, so they just perpetuated the cycle mindlessly. Shadow Weaver did not have this experience. She lived in a near utopian society, and then she signed up for evil out of a bruised ego. This sadistic mindset makes Shadow Weaver much more evil than the likes of Catra or Hordak. I'll use a comparison from Dragon Ball Z. Boo didn't know that murder was bad, so when Boo learned that murder is bad, he stopped killing people, despite having probably commit multiple genocides by this point. But anyways, the protagonists in Dragon Ball were able to forgive Boo. Hordak and Catra are under the assumption that killing people is a good thing, whereas Shadow Weaver completely understands how terrible it is, and she embraces it.
I was hard on you, I won't deny it, and I won't apologize.
If you're unfamiliar with Dragon Ball Z and Boo, I have another comparison. Batman doesn't blame Harley Quinn for all the terrible things she's done. Despite killing children, Batman sees Harley Quinn's heinous acts as a result of Joker's abuse. This is why everyone is so willing to forgive Catra in Season 5. There's a mutual understanding that Catra is the way she is because of her environment, and not because she consciously wanted to do evil acts. Ironically, Catra has a Harley Quinn streak. Attraction aside, this is why Adora asked Catra to join the rebellion repeatedly, but lost her mind when Glimmer teamed up with Shadow Weaver. Shadow Weaver is evil on purpose. Catra is evil by accident. The same is true for Hordak. Horde Prime is evil on purpose. Hordak is evil by accident. I acknowledge that Catra has done a crazy amount of terrible things, but she's not aware of how bad her actions are. Catra was raised by a sadistic witch who regularly delighted in torturing her for fun, skewing Catra's perspective on how to treat people. Shadow Weaver willingly signed up to perpetuate the cycle of abuse. I know there's other members in the Horde who aren't inherently evil, like Kyle, Lonnie, Rogelio, and oh my god, especially Scorpia. They're just blatantly not evil. But I don't feel like they can just run off like Adora did. Even though Scorpia grew up in the same environment as Catra, allegedly, Scorpia is a princess who was likely awarded Force Captain by virtue of bloodline. And not because she earned the position. This means that Scorpia was less likely on the receiving end of the Horde's abuse than the rest of the soldiers because she was treated like royalty. I mean, she is royalty. With less societal pressure, that gave Scorpia room to blossom into her own person instead of molded into a standard issue soldier. Scorpia did not have the same social pressures as Catra, and Scorpia understands that.
She's mean.
She's misunderstood! You of all people should know that!
While it's true that Scorpia is enabling Catra's behavior in the exact same way that Entrapta enabled Hordak to ruin more lives, Scorpia was trying to achieve the same effect on Catra that Entrapta had on Hordak. Which is, ultimately a positive resolution. The hope was that Scorpia would show Catra what true love and respect looked like, allowing Catra to be more introspective of how Shadow Weaver treats her, allowing Catra to develop feelings of self-worth and stop relying on Hordak and Shadow Weaver for validation. While Scorpia and Entrapta both enabled their partners in crime to do wickedly evil shit, it was for a good cause, which makes me uncomfortable to discuss because we can't really measure this sort of behavior, but understand it was eventually a good thing for everyone, okay? Okay. Unfortunately, regarding her relationship with Catra, Scorpia came off too strong in almost every single instance. What made it worse is that Scorpia actually has no idea how to help Catra. And in Entrapta's case, Hordak was insecure about his disability. Entrapta affirmed him and made sure he felt loved and respected despite being born with a less capable body. Not only that, Entrapta made him feel special for it. Acknowledging that Hordak's difference from everyone is something that makes her like him even more than she otherwise would have. All of a sudden, Hordak's body, something that he felt incredibly shamed for, it was something he felt proud of. Plus, making a cyberskeleton suit with Entrapta gave him the opportunity to genuinely bond with her, developing Hordak into a better person. If Entrapta didn't accidentally make Hordak feel good about his vulnerabilities, Entrapta might not have had such a profoundly positive effect on Hordak. Now, in regards to the younger duo, Scorpia completely missed the mark with Catra. I had multiple ideas about what Scorpia could have done to make Catra feel validated and give her the same experience that Hordak had with Entrapta, but every idea I wrote out had very clear evidence against it. Combing through the whole show, I returned to season 4, episode 11, where Catra stays up all night looking for Scorpia and has a mental breakdown, crying that she lost another important friend. This didn't seem that deep until I rewatched season 1, episode 11. There was a cinematic boom sound effect during one of the scenes.
She is the best friend ever. Ever.
So this scene was really weird since it's so subtext heavy that it could be thought of in like a million ways, but I want to share why I think this scene is important. Catra only ever made friends with Adora, or at least her only meaningful friendship prior to Scorpia. I don't know if Catra would even call it a friendship because, Horde. Before Scorpia says this line that I just showed to you to Catra, our favorite kitten is getting called evil by our favorite lesbian a couple minutes earlier in the same episode.
The Horde is evil.
Catra gets stunned into silence when Adora says this, as she's forced to be introspective about her actions. Catra tries to understand why she feels justified in her villainy, why she doesn't join up with Adora. Following this incident, Catra fully commits to the villain idea and embraces it, something she probably learned from Shadow Weaver. Catra chooses to cut a door out of her life. Upon returning to the Fright Zone with Entrapta's crystal, Scorpia, one of the most loving people that Catra knows, gives her validation and approval just by calling her the best friend to ever friend. Catra doesn't know how to deal with this because she rarely ever experiences positive feedback, but it helps Catra feel as though everything she's doing is correct and that a door was just projecting, undoing the belief she just formed about being the villain, making Catra further set in the ways that Shadow Weaver taught her to be. Scorpia enabled Catra to keep being a terrible person, which resulted in an even worse Catra. Scorpia never stood up for herself or punished Catra for being an asshole until it was too late. Scorpia quite literally fueled Catra's transition into the show's main villainess by positively rewarding her acts of evil and confusing Catra's developing moral compass every single step of the way. If Scorpia never did this, never tried to be the Wildcats cheerleader, Catra might not have turned out nearly as bad as she did. The funny part is Scorpia perpetuated the cycle of abuse with positivity, and that ultimately bites her in the ass.
You're a bad friend.
When Catra gets so obscenely nasty that Scorpia can't remain Catra's friend, Scorpia leaves. By this point in the show, Scorpia is one of the only people who Catra feels comfortable being vulnerable and honest in front of.
If I can pull this off, everything will have been worth it. All my hard work ignored because of one mistake. My dreams turning to dust in front of my eyes.
Sorry, can you carry her again?
Scorpia, you don't have to ask.
Carry her, idiot. Move.
Whip!
No, I'm not gonna say whip when I use the whip. No one does that.
Ooh, maybe you could say a catchphrase then, like whip.
Catra left me in charge. Me. Can you believe it?
No, I really can't. Hey, thanks for getting us out of there.
Anytime.
All right, come on.
Oh, gosh, look at us. Just two peas in a pod.
You really care, don't you?
Of course I care. You're Catra. You're our leader. You're everything to me. This is the first time I've ever seen you happy, period. We could, be happy.
I don't...
Catra has nothing but respect and appreciation for Scorpia. She does not know how to show that, though, because her bad behavior has been like, yeah, you go, girl. And Scorpia got fed up with this. This is why it's important to stand up for yourself, especially with friends and coworkers. It's no wonder that Catra breaks down and self-destructs when Scorpia calls her a bad friend and leaves. Catra thinks she was being a friend correctly. She has no idea why Scorpia has a sudden change of heart, and what makes it worse is the show never addresses it. Obviously, Scorpia is a good person who sees the best in people, but that is to a fault. She's a doormat that Catra walks all over. Not only that, she's a doormat that says, "Step on me again, please and thank you." Scorpia rarely reprimands Catra for doing anything bad and constantly showers her with praise for succeeding in villainy. Catra is a product of Shadow Weaver and Scorpia, perpetuating the cycle of abuse through drastically different methods. Scorpia had really good intentions with being nice to Catra, but it resulted in something awful. Meanwhile, Entrapta did not approach Hordak with the intention of befriending him. It just happened naturally and beautifully, in a way that just happened to benefit them both perfectly. Scorpia is a really scary reminder that nobody can just go around fixing people or expecting people to be good just because somebody is nice to them. Anyways, I find it very interesting how many similarities there are between Hordak and Catra, and how the show took two characters that had basically the same backstory and showed two different outcomes based upon how people interacted with them. Obviously, Hordak perpetuated the cycle of abuse, but he was pretty close to ending it with the help of Entrapta. That is until Catra perpetuated it back on Hordak. It's like the behavior version of an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Anyways, if you've watched this whole video up to this point, then you might also like my video explaining if Nate Stevenson wrote She-Ra. Also, please subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.